Hi, everybody, and welcome to our next episode of the Harry Potter Trading Card Game Revival podcast. My name is Sammy,
I'm Reese.
And I'm Huamin.
and today we're going to be talking about power cost and what that means, how it affects the game, how it affects design, how it affects deck building, the
How it
colors, and all that
affects
good.
everything.
Yeah,
No
because it
doubt.
does affect everything, except for characters and adventures. Those don't really care for the
Uh,
most part.
Definitely does tangentially affect them, because it affects the other parts of the game around them.
Yeah, but we
So
should start by talking about
it's
like what is power cost.
power cost is very simply just the amount of power that you need in order to play a card. It's a limitation on playing cards that allows the designers, the original O5 designers, and now us, to use as one of these levers to say you must be this far into the game and build your deck in such a way in order to play this card.
So obviously that comes mainly in the form of lessons, which are a one card and one action to play to get that power, which tends to take up a lot of a player's time. If you're on the lower side, it will take less time. If you're on the higher side, obviously it will take more. But it's not just about necessarily playing the cards out to get power. It's potentially also the amount of time you have to spend using actions to draw cards, or as the game progresses naturally from turn to turn, drawing to make sure you have the lessons to be able to play them at all, or if there are cards that provide more power than just the one action it takes to play. For example, the very, very popular Wand Shop. There is a lot of things that affect the way in which the power progression of a game goes.
Yeah, typically in your starting hand, most decks are going to be seeing between 2 to 5 lessons. Let's call it like 3 lessons or something. And most decks run somewhere around like 20 lessons, give or take, right? So you have about a third of a chance whenever you draw a card in order to play a lesson. So once you've played out your like 3 to 4 lessons using your 3 to 4 actions, now it's taking approximately like 2 to 3 actions in order to get another power on the board to play your higher cost cards, assuming that you're only using actions to draw cards and actions to play lessons.
And that's one of the considerations, right? Is on the face of it, it feels like it should be something that's quite linear. I use an action, I play a lesson, but that's not necessarily the case because of the time you must take sometimes to use those actions to draw cards instead. Early on, it might be very linear where you like, if I want to get one cost card out, it's going to take me this much time. If I want to get a 3 cost card out, it's going to take me this much time. But that's just not the case for something like 8 cost or 10 cost or 12 cost.
So that kind of comes back to your power curve in your deck. At what costs are the cards in my deck? And at what points in the game am I going to actually be able to play them? Now, that's like a very deck specific thing, but that also informs you on like how many lessons are you going to run in your deck, which goes back to Reese's, I believe you wrote it, right? That article somewhere on the interwebs
Yes.
talking about a statistical analysis of this is how likely you are to see this many lessons if you're running this many lessons in your deck.
Yeah, so that was an article on the Revival site, not the Accio site. Yeah, about what's called hypergeometric distribution, just a fancy saying word to describe the curve in which statistics plays on drawing cards versus getting them when you've got certain sample size within a population. And that plays out for us pretty quickly because of that, people play a third lessons in their deck, say 20, 24 lessons in a deck, sort of starts becoming, what would you say, like impactful earlier on than I think people expect. It's sort of,
Yeah.
you have in a 24 lesson deck, say, you have an 8% chance that you'll only draw one lesson in your opening hand, or 21% chance that it's only 2 lessons. Sure, you could play both those lessons out in the first turn, but starting on the next turn, you've got 8 cards you've drawn in total for now. There's a pretty decent chance, maybe 1 in every 5 games, maybe 2 in every 5 games, that you're going to not be able to play any card above 2 cost.
And that's one of the reasons why I think lesson providing professors are extremely popular in this game, because it's not a linear progression of, oh, I put in one action, I get one lesson. It's a very linear progression at first, but as you want to breach into those higher lesson or higher power cost cards, it's actually more than one action for one power, which means that if you're starting at 1 and you only in like your 20% of the games you only draw two lessons within the first like 9 cards. Instead of being limited only to 2 cost cards, you're now limited to only 3 cost cards, which is a much bigger difference. Or say if you only draw 3 lessons, now you're only limited to 4 cost cards, etc., etc.
Yeah, and I think, everyone out there in our community aren't like mathematics professors, so they don't look at like a statistical curve to get their understanding of this. But I think the vast majority of the community understand that intuitively as a feeling when you play the professors, and that's why they're so commonly played. Not only do they do the color fixing thing, but they also sort of just get you where you need to be quicker and more consistently. I think 4 and 5 are big break points in our game for the removal cards now, and those interaction pieces. So the professors are very, very popular for that reason, because they just smooth out that fluctuation a bit.
So you're talking about the breakpoint essentially of when we get to a certain amount of power and play from all these lessons that we're playing. And that breakpoint you're talking about now, it's like that 4 to 5 range for a removal piece. And I think that what this kind of leans into is how cards are scaling up and whether they're doing that in a linear fashion or some other type of fashion. And O5 had a very particular way of scaling cards that was very linear and straight to the point. So let's talk about kind of that power scaling and what that looks like in O5 and maybe what we're doing.
You just have to look at any chain of cards that have very similar effects. Like you look at Curious Raven, it's a 1/1 for 2. You look at Boa Constrictor, it's a 2/2 for 4. You look at Vicious Wolf, it's a 3/3 for 6. Wow. Can you see a pattern here? You look at Mountain Troll, that's a 4/4 for 8. And then you look at Giant Squid, that's not in base set, and we don't talk about Giant Squid. But I think maybe a little bit later on, they started to realize, wait a second, why would we give them a 5/5 for 10? Because we talked about before, it's not the same amount of effort to go from 0 to 5 as it is to go from 5 to 10.
Yeah, so like if you're playing something with 6 lessons out, you play your Vicious Wolf, they do 3 damage per turn. You could very well, by the time your opponent's gotten to that 10 power for 5/5 to even be able to play a 5/5 creature, the game's over from the Vicious Wolves, and like it wasn't even close. Like from a very, very small, narrow window point of view, that's the sort of thing that you can look at when you're comparing those linear progressions.
Yeah, like I would 100% of the time take a deck with 56 lessons and 4 Vicious Wolves over 56 lessons and 4 Giant Squid. It's like no contest.
Yeah.
Some other chains that you see is like Vermilius, 4 cost, 3 damage, Bluebell Flames, 7 cost, 4 damage, Verdilius, kinda, 9 cost, 5 damage. Again, Verdilius is out in Diagon Alley. Maybe they had like, I thought maybe it shouldn't be 10 cost, maybe it should be 9 cost, but still a very kind of linear progression. Or your healing cards, Hospital Wing, 4 cost, discard 1, heal 8, Burning Bitterroot Bomb, 6 cost, heal 10, or discard 1, Potions Lesson, heal 10, Stargrass Salve, 8 cost, discard 1 Potions Lesson, heal 12.
Yeah, just a very not boring game, but very, I don't know, predictable game. And I think one of the things that we saw a lot was lower cost, like creature decks, for example, were just kind of the thing that people always went to because it was so much quicker to get to them and the lower cost creatures could start doing damage sooner. And when you're doing this linear thing up to higher cost creatures, you're not getting more of a benefit. And so high cost creatures, we've heard the community complain about multiple times, just never really have a deck because there's no real point in playing them unless there's something that they're interacting with in a very specific way. So that linear stuff, I think, makes the math very easy for like how to design a card. But then I think it leads to boring and bad card design when you're following that linear scale up so high.
It's severely underpowered high curve, which is what we've consistently seen in O5, I think. Barring some like strange outliers, which of course the elephant in the room is VTJ. Venomous Tentacular Juice, 9 cost. Your opponent draws twice the number of cards they have in their hand. But you'll notice that this card doesn't follow the trend because there's no like your opponent draws cards equal to the number of cards in their hand costed somewhere else.
Or 1.5 times.
Yeah. 1.5 times, 2 times, 2.5 times.
Complicated math now.
Yeah. We can see like many of these good O5 cards are cards that are kind of like one-off effects. They're not
Mhm.
like scaled based on this linear scaling of power cost to effect that we see in a lot of O5 cards.
So to throw a little bit of a spanner in the wrench on the script here for you guys, what would a 8 cost vanilla creature to replace Mountain Troll, what would its damage per turn and health be? Keeping the, health being equal to the damage per turn for it to be a playable card.
Well, we did make Tebow, and I'm not saying Tebow's super playable, but we did make Tebow and Goblet of Fire, and that's 9 cost, 5/6. So I don't know.
And is Tebow good? Is Tebow a good card? Who
No,
knows?
no. Pumbaa is not a good card, but Pumbaa's a fun card.
Yeah.
Pumbaa is a fun card. Again, though, but like that's not even either, and it's
True, true.
something we've also discussed to go off on a bit of a tangent there is at what point does the health become irrelevant? 4
Yeah.
health, 5 health, 16
Yeah.
health versus 10 health. It doesn't really matter for those numbers. People are going to try and remove it strictly speaking. So the Tebow is really, it's a 9 cost card where you're looking at 5 damage per turn. And is that why it's not so good? Well, what is that number?
I honestly just don't know in the current state of the game if creatures without effects are just good at all, unless they're super aggressively costed. For example,
Yeah.
we made Wing Boar, which was a 3 cost 2/2, but you can only have one in play ever. So even though it's beating the rate of like a boa constrictor, technically it's better, but the uniqueness clause on it holds it back. And like even that doesn't really see tons of play. Like just a vanilla creature, I don't think is ever going to be super playable unless there is a potential future starter that gives some kind of benefit to vanilla creatures.
We could print a 8 power cost 10/10.
I mean, I think Mountain Troll would be very sad, but sure.
Yeah. I don't know if we'd print an 8 power cost 10/10.
Oh, there we
But like an
go.
8 power
Approaching
cost.
the line.
I think at that point I would play that 8 power cost 10/10, and then I
Yeah.
would play like a Steel Claw or something.
Yeah, it's like a numbers game at a certain point, right? Like, okay, 8 power cost 10/10, too good. 8 power cost 9/9, probably still too good. 8 power cost 8/8, and then we keep
Yeah,
dropping
there we
that.
go.
And you try to find a number, and I think the correct number for an 8 power cost is not actually going to be a whole number. It's not going to be something nice like 4 or 5. It's going to be like
Like 4.5.
4.8. Yeah.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Now,
Every
now people
other
have to
turn
like
do
chop
5
the card.
damage.
Yeah. Maybe when we
So-
actually put out that joke set, we'll have that 8 power cost like 4.7 or something. 4.7, 4.7.
I wanted to touch back on another point with the reference to the cutoff. So we were talking about the cutoff for, playing those removal spells, like picking on Neville or Depulso and Stairs to Slides now. Therefore, I think there's also a cutoff on the other direction as well, which is looking at what point in the game you have the lessons you'd require for any particular thing that you're after. So it's sort of in a 24 lesson deck, by turn sort of 3 or 4, you've drawn 10, 11 cards. About 90% of the time, you'll have 3 cards, three lessons rather, guaranteed to have been drawn every time, but only 75% of the time will you have 4 lessons. So when we're talking about the power curve and like these higher end cards, those numbers don't really look that good, right? I mean, only 4 lessons, 3 out of 4 games by the time you get to turn 3. Otherwise, you're going to have to start wasting your actions trying to draw for more lessons. And then, as we've already talked about, sometimes that's only 1 in 3 cards. It's going to be a lesson. You're going to waste a bunch of actions. So things like ramp cards, the one shot, look quite enticing because they can skip a whole bunch of lessons and stuff like that. But yeah, I just a reflection the other way around, not just where do we naturally get to a point, a break point where you really focus on, okay, if I keep my deck this small for 5 cost, I'm going to be able to play my cards quite consistently. If you're building a deck on the other end where I want to get to a high power, regardless of what it's going to take me, then you do really have to start pushing up the lesson count in your deck, or you're going to have to be okay with the fact that you're going to start wasting actions pretty early on to try and draw more lessons.
Or you just have to dedicate like 10, 15 cards to these are ramp cards. These are cards that I need in my deck in order to hit those 11, 12, 13 cost cards, like your Rip and Peace one shot, your GOF books, your
Yeah.
Dragonheart
And
wands, etc., etc.
And I think that's what we'll see a lot more of going forward is us playing with different design spaces around that 3, 4, 5 costs to get ramp at that level, particularly because the lessons naturally peter off at that number. And start becoming problematic in their consistency. We want the ramp spells to be coming in at that point, or the ramp items or events or whatever it is, to start coming in or coming online at that point so they can smooth out the lessons a little bit.
Because otherwise, like high cost decks just can't exist in the meta.
Exactly, yeah.
Because you're going to get blown out by those decks that are playing 4 or 5 cost efficient creatures or whatever that are just going to run you over every time.
So not only are we balancing the high cost cards to the natural timing of, they're going to take more actions to even get there to begin with, but we're also trying to balance those high cost cards to you're going to take a lot more time even finding them, the power cost providing cards to get there, not just playing them out.
That's probably enough about like the linear power scaling of O5, because we still haven't talked about another facet of kind of power cost-ish that Wizards of the Coast has used to balance the cost of playing cards, which is your lesson discard and your lesson return, which is a little bit more rare than your to play this card, discard 1 potions lesson from play. Where O5, usually you can see in the trends that a lesson discard is usually worth like a -2 power cost, and a lesson bounce to hand is usually worth like a -1 to your power cost, which I don't agree with, but that's why we're here in Revival and changing things. So I would like to say that we have like an amazing script on, yes, we do this, and this as reasons for putting lesson discard on Revival card, which I think we have a more nuanced understanding of lesson discard, but in that it's not just a strict power cost lowering ability that we have to use, but we use it more for trying to prevent abuse. So like when you play a high cost potions card, if you have to discard 2 potions lessons to play that card, then you're going to require those 2 potions lessons in play, which means that you can't be just like starting Professor Cerberus Snape and then ramping up with one shop, Rip and Peace one shop up there in order to play it.
I think an important thing with lesson discard too is that you're not just discarding lessons, you're undoing actions, which are the economy of the game. And that's a really large way to impact balancing cards, to like require essentially the card you're playing plus 2 lesson discards, let's say for Welsh Green Dragon, plus 3 actions total, 2 to play 2 lessons and then 1 to play Welsh Green. So the lesson discard or the return, the cost is so much more than just the lesson.
Not for Welsh Green Dragon. You play Welsh Green Dragon and you end the game. Let's be
Well,
real.
It's true.
That's another point to it, isn't it? It's like, is it really offsetting the cheaper cost of something if it is just a finisher? But yet to Sammy's point, like, there's the action investment in playing the lesson. You can count that as an action if you need to get back up to that power. That's definitely, strictly speaking, action investment cost. And then also, as we we're talking about before, probably 2 or 3 more actions to draw another lesson and then another action to play it. You think about it, it's quite taxing on the action economy, which is, the whole central part of this game compared to other games.
But one thing that kind of throws a wrench in that, in Revival at least, is that there are definitely more ways to benefit from discarding lessons, mostly looking at Hagrid, and more ways to get back or put lessons into play without using actions. Things like Hermione's Time Turner, things like Rowena Ravenclaw, that you can actually kind of recoup or like ignore the cost of losing these lessons, especially if you have either the right starter or the right deck. That makes that less of a cost. So that's also something that we have to keep in mind that O5 didn't really have to keep in mind when we are putting lesson discard as a cost on card.
Yeah, so like during the testing phase for Hermione Overworked Student, the discard creature deck was very prominent in the testing. And when we were looking at her, we were sort of looking not just at the recursion of the lessons with the creatures, but essentially more for her the action side. So was she making those low cost creatures which were previously so impactful at slowing the aggro creature player down? Was the offset of her using an action to bring lessons back really giving them too much tempo, too much speed, which was one of the considerations. I think she went from multiple times per turn to just once per turn now. So
I think she also started at like needing only 4 lessons in discard, and now she's 5.
Yeah.
The 4 to 5 was really rough.
She didn't need any of the very first go, right?
You're
She
asking
might
a
not have
question from a
needed
long
any.
time ago.
Yeah,
Maybe
I
the
think
first iteration.
yeah, the very first iteration was not once per turn, and you didn't need any minimum number of lessons in the discard, which obviously we fixed along the way. We could probably say,
We nuked that
yeah,
pretty quickly.
yeah, because I mean it was just at that point too good. Yeah, so those lower cross creatures, comparing them to that it's like a speed thing as well as whether or not the power curve was a problematic thing there.
So with all of this about the power cost and lesson discarding and everything else, we talked a lot about the original 5 sets and what their linear power scaling looks like and just kind of how they have kind of scaled some stuff and how they use the lesson discard to kind of help with all of that. And one thing that is a common thing in many card games is power creep and kind of the idea of making cards stronger that are pretty equivalent to another version of itself. Either it's a better costed card or just does more stuff, and it's just a power creep card. Let's talk about this a little bit and kind of the different kinds of power creep that we might see in what we're doing and what O5 was doing. A real basic example of just kind of power creep for everybody to look at is Leaky Cauldron and Hair Care Potion. That would just be kind of a strict power creep example, but there's many others that you'll find in both the original sets and then also in the revival sets based on the O5 stuff.
I don't think it's right to say that power creep is like a bad thing. In fact, I think that the reverse of power creep, what's it called? Power
Stagnation.
aggression. Yeah, stagnation, something like that, is actually extremely unhealthy for the game. If each and every set that comes out is just like worse than the set before it, like if I'm not saying Heir of Slytherin is worse than Chamber of Secrets, but if Heir of Slytherin is like worse than Chamber of Secrets, then it's not good for the meta of the game because you're not going to see Heir of Slytherin cards being played. The meta is going to stay the same and stagnate.
But I think that's a really good point because Chamber of Secrets is seen as the most powerful O5 set. And I don't know if like there's a lot of cards in it that power creep necessarily, but the set itself is, I think, a power creep set. And I think that we kind of return Air Slytherin down from that power quite a bit, maybe back to like a Diagon Alley level or like a Quidditch Cup level or something.
Yeah, which is one of the reasons why I think Air Slytherin doesn't see much play. Not many of their cards see play. It's not that power creep is bad. It's that power creep in the wrong ways and power creep in excessive power creep is bad.
I think taking an old thing and making it slightly better just because of gameplay reasons or stuff has changed or new cards or whatever, like that's okay to do in small ways. But I agree with you entirely. Like doing a whole set of 90 cards that is power crept is just awful.
So it's also, I suppose, like the amount it's power crept as well. Like you can power creep very easily by just throwing the balance off of a card entirely. Like power creeping Hover Charm by putting it back in their deck and doing 5 damage or something I had to tack on that last little bit then. Would be like just far too much. It's doing too much compared to every other card, and it's not clever. It's not balancing to the rest of the game. So it's easy to do power creep, but you need to do it, I think, gently and make sure you're not just blowing everything else out of the water.
I think I had a statement somewhere on the Discord where I was like, I don't mind power creeping bad cards in O5. Like,
yes.
You look at Bluebell Flames and Freezing Charm, their charms cost spells that cost 7, choose an opponent or creature, deal 4 damage to it. Like, no one's playing this card. This card is so bad. If you're putting this card in your deck, like, I don't know what you're doing. So that's why we have Hurling Heck, which is 7 cost, same cost. It's a spell, doesn't have any keywords, just like Bluebell Flames and Freezing Charm, but it hits your opponent for 4 and hits one of their creatures for 4 if they have creatures. It's wow.
Yeah, and I think that the power creep discussion a little bit touches on maybe some of the design philosophy that we saw in the original 5 sets, which they seemed very focused on both players will just play creatures to do damage, and then both players will play cards to remove their opponent's creatures from play. And that is going to be how this game is going to function.
Which
And
is
awful.
very lucky. Yeah, I mean, it's very lucky they put creatures in every single color then, right?
Wait, for real, right?
Yeah.
And I think obviously we are changing that in a lot of ways and we're trying to do different things. So I think a lot of those cards that are just very stagnant for that original design philosophy and we're now power creeping them in small ways, I think is totally okay for the game and probably a very positive thing.
Also, Reese, like, don't worry. You can play things like mono potions and then just kill them with slow acting venom. You don't need to go with the trick.
Best card ever.
Yeah, slow acting venom. I did think, yeah, that balances all the rest of the lesson types perfectly. Yeah,
Yeah, but
exactly.
we see two kinds of power creep. We see like this very strict one, like Leaky Cauldron into Hair Care, and then we see other ones that are kind of like adjacent and they're not as direct. So let's talk about how we're doing that and some examples of kind of this like circumstantial power creep as opposed to this direct, very strict one.
As we talked about, linear O5 power scaling, not very good because it just requires so much more investment to get into those higher levels of power. So we've been trying to push the power of high cost cards a little bit to make them a little bit more impactful and worth it to actually get there. If you look at Giant Squid versus Abraxan, yeah, Giant Squid costs 10, Abraxan costs 12. If we went with the linear power scaling of O5, Abraxan should have read like 615 or something and then had no
615.
ability. Yeah. I mean, like, yeah. But instead, Abraxan is a 10/7 that comes into play, deals 5 damage to your opponent, and fetches an item back from your discard pile. And
Yeah,
it's like,
that's
wow.
the card.
Yeah, that's not linear scaling. And it's also good for the game because when you get to 12 power, you deserve something nice.
Yes.
yeah. So I think that's another great point to talk about with the natural lesson progression of the game and how many lessons you would have at any given turn, given your say 20 or 24, probably 24 is the better number to have, given to say you have 24 lessons in your deck. By the time you're getting to consistently having 12 lessons out, say it's that without any other ramp, you're looking at, turn 20 or so before that is sort of naturally occurring. Like if I actually look at my Excel sheet here, 12 lessons, say 90% of the time is turn 27. Okay, that's pretty bad.
Yeah.
The game was over on average, given a lot of the analysis we do after the tournaments and the games we record. Games are generally over by turn 20. So
the game was over
the game
like
7 turns ago,
10 turns ago,
and that's only 90% of the time,
Yeah.
So you probably want to be making sure that something that costs that high really does almost get the game done on its own for you, because either you're going to take 27 turns to get there naturally, or you're going to have to spend a lot of actions just drawing up to those cards, or drawing to get enough lessons to get up to those cards. So the action investment versus a deck that only requires something that's 4, 5, 6 cost is completely different, and they will end the game a lot quicker than you.
Yeah, and getting up to those high power costs is different depending on what color you're playing. So on top of the power cost being one way that designers, as Holman had said at the beginning, for us to kind of dictate at what point should you be able to play this and in what situations or whatever based on the power you have in play, the colors also kind of help give us a tool to restrict what cards can be played together or what colors you're going to have to play together to get certain effects or cards or whatnot. So let's kind of talk about like what the colors are kind of doing traditionally to get up to those power costs and whatnot, whether some of them are ramping by getting actual lessons or some of them are using more mana rocks, which is a term for Magic, cards that just sit and play and provide power.
Traditionally, most of the ramp pieces that you saw in the game existed in potions and charms, where charms had their wands and potions had their cauldrons, and that was about it. Like basically every other color, if they had something, was just provides 1 power and is about the same as just playing a lesson.
And I think the other colors, like Quidditch got brooms, but they were pretty 1 for 1. But the potions, or sorry, Transfig and creatures, I think their only other like mana rock cards were the books, I think, from Diagon Alley. I don't think in the
Uh,
original 5 they got anything
nah,
else.
nah.
Even those books are 1-for-1, right?
Yeah, they're all 1 for 1.
I
Quidditch
think the
has
only
a couple
thing,
brooms
Yeah.
that are a little bit
yeah,
higher, and then
and Quidditch pitch.
creatures, it has like yeah, cage, and it has not one but two books at 2 costs. But yeah, they're
Yeah.
all 1 for 1. And
Yeah.
then
The 1-for-1 Quidditch got Quidditch pitch, which is spells only as well, so that has a
yeah,
restriction to it. It is very rare in the O5 sets.
It did seem like maybe this is just a random thought I had when you brought up Quidditch Pitch. But between Quidditch Pitch, Wand Shop, and Dumbledore's office, particularly more, I guess, maybe even Albus Dumbledore, Dumbledore's office, and then Quidditch Pitch, they started putting this reduction on more permanent cards that weren't providing power, but just did a strict reduction. And maybe that was a direction they were going to start going more had the next set after Chamber of Secrets come out. I don't know. I just thought of that as you brought up Quidditch Pitch as maybe a potential direction for them.
I think it's also a direction that we can think about. We
Yeah.
played around a lot with power costs, mostly going up.
Bravado is a temporary one as well, and the reduction seems like a similar thing to the Mana Rock, right? Where it's basically a substitute for X amount of the power that you require. But the only real differences that comes in would be either the restrictions on Dumbledore's offices for items only, or Quidditch pitches for Quidditch spells and or Quidditch cards rather. The only other restriction would be if you suddenly lost the power provided to play those cards originally, or in our case, if we do something like providing for other colors. So an example would be Lucius's cane,
Yeah.
where you have one color providing for another. These
Yeah.
wouldn't do that sort of thing either.
I think these ramp pieces, where they are in the color, how are they affecting power cost thresholds? Are they a permanent effect? Are they a temporary effect? Are they only hitting items? Are they only hitting spells? Like, cards always have to be designed and balanced around how fast and how easy it is to hit those thresholds. Like, it's easy to talk about VTJ because VTJ ends the game when you play it twice. There's usually no question about that. And it's like, how easy is it to hit that 9 cost? What's the requirements to hitting 9 cost, having 2 VTJs in hand, and then being able to play them? I think there was a massive design failure in how easy it is to get to that state to win the game with VTJ. So we decided, sorry, you can't actually have 2 VTJs in your hand anymore.
Yeah, and we made it so you can still do it, but you definitely need a higher cost because you need at least 12 now with like a 3 turns combo. We just increased the cost, which I think helped balance it a little bit.
Yeah, or other possible ways of recursion. You can get like 3 actions and play VTJ, Reparo, VTJ. You can play Hannah Abbott a turn before VTJ, activate Hannah. But these are all like, okay, now you have to do extra steps, and it's not just asking for you to have 9 power or the ability to play 9 cost spells, which is kind of different from 9 power because stuff like Bravado exists, and then have 2 VTJs in hand.
One of the other things that I think Transfig does most, but I think the other colors might start seeing more of it in the future, is Transfig goes and fetches actual lessons from your deck through things like research, alchemy, history of magic homework. We made one that was a Marauder card that I'm blanking on the name of right now.
I solemnly swear.
Yeah. And so Transfig is the current color that really focuses on I'm going to go fetch actual lessons from my deck and put those into play, which is just like a difference that it does compared to some other stuff.
Yeah, Apparicium, the best ramp card in the game. Asterisk. Charms is like kind of edging into that territory with their new Standard Book of Spells Grade 4, but not quite. And then Potions has a couple like pull from discard into play. Maybe it's just Gathering with Ghoul, not Gathering with Ghouls, Holidays with Hag.
I think right now it's just Holidays with Hags. Quidditch is doing a little more with Quidditch does care about Quidditch stuff. So they're saying if you do thing, go get Quidditch lesson. If you do Quidditch thing, go do Quidditch lesson. And so Quidditch is kind of doing that as well, but in a very Quidditchy way. And Transfig, I think, might be a little stronger in terms of this lesson fetch because they let you go fetch any type of lesson, not just a Quidditch lesson. So Quidditch is just screwing itself over like normal, but that's why I love it.
Transfig being able to fetch any lesson is also extremely important because you can run a deck with just like 3 to 5 charms lessons or something and still play charms cards pretty consistently if you're fetching them with alchemy.
Yeah.
or whatever. Alchemy, which is a bad card that got significantly better with Hermione Spew. Thanks, Hermione Spew.
Yes, we talked a lot about what the original five sets were doing, kind of woven in there in a little more of a subtle way, were ways that it influenced how Revival is designing cards and kind of our thought process when we're designing cards now because of the basis that was set up. So let's just talk about like how has our thought process changed on costing cards over the past six sets now that we've given out to the public.
I think how we were doing Revival is all wrong. We need to go back to the O5 linear progression. I want to play my 12 cost, deal 6 damage to a creature or an opponent. That seems
Real
like
quick, what you just said made me think about something. So, Caught by Snape is a notorious adventure from the original five set that requires you to use actions to play lesson cards 3 times, I think. And this whole conversation we're having right now about how the original game was really much so about play out your lessons and use actions to do that in order to play higher cards that will let you win the game. It seems like even though Caught by Snape is a very powerful card, it really plays into what their design philosophy was for how the game should really function. And in theory, because they wanted the game to function that way, Caught by Snape should be super simple to solve, but it's got its own issues. But I just made that kind of connection as you were talking just now.
I think also they're thinking that the reward on Caught by Snape is actually
Oh,
a really good one,
yeah. No.
right? Like
Yeah.
it just gives you like 3, 4, 5 actions. Like that balances out the card.
I think a big thread of what we've been kind of talking about throughout all of this is at this point, this is 2025 now. Happy New Year's, everybody. And we've been now doing this for 5 years. We've released 6 sets, I think, now. So we've been working on developing cards for this game for 2.5 years longer than the original designers. We have released one more set at least. I think with the next set that comes out, we'll have released more cards. And we're also doing more organized play and able to analyze more tournament data and actually have more of a community, mainly because the internet is now a thing, whereas back in like 2001, it was a thing, but it wasn't really a thing at the same time.
Yeah.
And so
It was
like we
just
have
post boards, yeah.
it was exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So we have like all these benefits where we're able to just get more data, hear more from players, have players talk to each other more. As designers, we're able to talk with them better than a chat room where somebody calls himself professor and answers random questions. So like we have all these benefits that help us to understand more about like how the game is actually in practice playing out and what is working and not working, and then make adjustments to that in a more impactful way and in a more intentional and time specific kind of way, which I think is probably just a bunch of things that are kind of meshing together to not make what we're doing better, but to give enough small improvements that the game is balancing a little more, and there's different ways to build decks and play games now.
Yeah, I think as far as our design philosophy goes now, it might not be said out loud, but I think we all have that intuitive understanding when designing cards that the super low cost cards, like 1 or 2 cost, we mainly consider, do we want players to be able to play them on turn 1 or turn 2? The 3, 4, 5, even 6 cost cards is, do we want them to be able to be played earlier on? And then as we move up from there, getting into that space, which we may need to readjust that evaluation as more of those mana rocks, those items or events or creatures that provide more than 1 power for the 1 action it takes to play them. As more of those come out, we might have to readjust it. But the higher end cards, where we definitely go, okay, need to have some kick behind them to be at that cost to justify a 10 or a 12 cost card.
I think even if those mana rocks do become like a more prominent thing and then they become quote unquote like an issue of some sort, I think that again, kind of going back to what I just said, like we have the power to then in the next set provide answers to that or provide small corrections to try to like keep it balanced without having to move like the end goal too much. Obviously, that's still an important thing to keep in mind, but we just have that ability because of the interaction, the slower pace of set releases and everything to really give those answers in sets.
Yeah, even then, they're probably only small adjustments. It's not like
Yeah.
us adding in the books from Goblet of Fire where they, at a 5 cost provide 2 power instead of 1 power for the action that they take to play. That's not going to suddenly make every card need to be 15 cost if it's a really good card or something. So
Mhm.
I think it's small adjustments as we go, but we'll get that new intuition for exactly where they sit on that curve now.
Yeah, we also have a note that we're pushing for higher cost cards is something to actually go for. And one thing that we didn't talk about before recording this is that with the banned and restricted list, we talked about this I think at the end of the last tournament podcast, but removing a bunch of the things or banning a bunch of cards that restrict your lessons or discard them from play allowed for more combo decks or at least more higher cost decks to actually be able to breathe and be in the tournament. And I think that's another thing that we have going up for us is the BNR list does provide us that ability to make those small adjustments to allow for those higher cost card decks to actually be a thing. Because before it was either you're playing a lower cost deck, you're playing one that caps out at like 6, maybe 7, or it's VTJ, and then high cost stuff doesn't really have a place because the original meta was just so quick and the removal was so punishing.
Rip in peace, one shot.
I think that's really the summary and the big takeaway from this podcast. Poor one shop.
I mean, we've referenced it so many times. I feel like it's
We really
not
have.
right to not end with like a note on one shop of it is problematic. Hopefully,
Yeah.
it was seen through this conversation that it's kind of problematic in that it ramps you at a very low cost, very high permanently, and allows you to hit these thresholds extremely easily.
Yeah.
Yes. All in
but-
one card without peers of its skill level in that area in one color. It is problematic for that reason because all these things we were talking about where you need to be hitting a certain power level at a certain time with a certain amount of investment from the player all get skipped because of one shop. Your power was 4, now it's doubled to 8, and that only took you one action and one card. Not only is the power of it super above everything else, it's also swingy in whether or not I actually drew that card versus your opponent actually drawing that card. So
I will
a
still
great-
vote for it to be unbanned. Wands up for wand shop.
a great reflection of what we were talking about, though, covering pretty much every point about the power curve.
Well, thank you everybody for tuning in and listening to our conversation about power cost. Hopefully this helps you build your decks a little better by just kind of understanding the commitment that you need to give to get to those higher cost cards versus lower cost and whatnot. And hopefully this also gives you a bit of insight into how we're designing cards when we're designing cards.
Oh man.
And make sure to follow all of our social medias below, and we'll chat with you later. See ya.
Peace.
Sayers.